Hello everyone, my name is Crispin. A while ago when I made this channel, a number of Israeli friends, of which I have many, reached out to me saying that, Crispin, we know you love Israel and beloved the Jewish people, and yet we are concerned that this Lithuania that you admire so much is not remembering the Holocaust in the way we think is appropriate as a unique event in world history. I was surprised by these comments, and I thought, if there's one thing I know about Lithuania, is that it is not anti-Semitic. In fact, it's almost fashionable to be Jewish in Lithuania today. And yet, I wasn't sure or educated about this particular issue, so I made it my business to learn everything I could about Lithuania, how it remembers the Holocaust, its role within it, and to what extent these allegations are true or false. I feel now I am in the right position to make this video and that now is the correct time. There are 5 main reasons to do this today. The first is that last month, the Lithuanian parliament passed the strongest ever resolution on anti-Semitism on the 80th anniversary of its National Holocaust Remembrance Day. So strong was this wording and uncompromising in its tenets that it translated the whole thing into Hebrew and published it in Israel. Not the sort of thing you do if you're in any way tepid about this issue. The second reason is that at the Malmo conference recently, in support of the first ever EU strategy on anti-Semitism, the Lithuanian president, Gitanas Nausėda, gave powerful remarks.
One of the best instruments we have is, of course, education. The Lithuanian school curricula will be updated so that they reflect recommendations on teaching and learning about the Holocaust. Holocaust memorial places across Lithuania are being renovated each year. I am proud to note that local communities, students and their teachers are actively involved in these activities. In our turbulent times, open dialogue based on facts is absolutely crucial. What we cannot tolerate is anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and attempts to distort historic reality that take new forms in the digital space. I welcome the efforts of European Union to address these important issues, in particular the first ever European Union strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. Lithuania is ready to contribute.
So convincing was his remarks that the Israeli ambassador to Lithuania personally and publicly thanked the Lithuanian president for these comments. Again, not something Israelis would do if this wasn't in any way convincing. The third is that there was an incident published famously where a member of the Lithuanian parliament made comments about Jews during the Holocaust that some say were taken out of context, and personally I am unfamiliar with the specifics. However, it did earn a stern and rare public rebuke by the US ambassador to Lithuania for that remark. And it is, I think, quite instructive that that particular parliamentarian resigned from all of their committee activity related to this issue, and also resulted in the subsequent resolution passing, which I mentioned as point 1. The fourth reason is that there is a new book specifically on the Lithuanian Holocaust that has been published by the German historian Christoph Deichmann, which goes into extraordinary detail the different actors and influences that resulted in what happened in Lithuania in 1941. And the fifth reason is, as in my own channel, we move to part 4 of the History of Lithuania series, it is striking to me just how much the story of Lithuania is a Jewish story. At the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when Napoleon enters Vilnius, he calls that city the Jerusalem of the North. And not without reason, at that time, 1/3 of the city's population was Jewish, and over 100 synagogues dotted the landscape. It is impossible, as we move forward in the history, to overlook the issue of the Holocaust and how that massively transformed the panorama of that entire society. And since I don't want to dwell on the Holocaust in the History of Lithuania series, I want this video to stand alone so that I can refer to it when discussing that period as we move on to other issues of relevance to the Lithuanians today, most notably the atrocities perpetrated by the Soviet Union during those decades of occupation. So what was the Lithuanian Holocaust? Well, the first thing to remember is that the Holocaust was a European-wide phenomenon. Wherever the Nazis had power, this occurred. So it is not unique to Lithuania. But as with all countries, there are certain unique characteristics. And one of those is the totality of the destruction of the Jews of Lithuania. 95% of the Jewish population died during the Holocaust in that country. That is unique in the sheer scale. The second is that it all happened really early. This was before Auschwitz and before the gas chambers. Most Lithuanian Jews were shot, and that happened in 1941 and early 1942. So how did this happen in its scale, and why did it happen when it did? Well, the first characteristic to remember is that Lithuania was an occupied country. It had been occupied prior to the war by the Soviet Union, completely annexed with over 20,000 Soviet troops on Lithuanian soil. When the Germans advanced into Lithuania, they were heralded as liberators. And the Lithuanians believed that cooperating with the Germans meant that they would achieve their national sovereignty against the communist oppressors who had occupied their country. It meant that they wanted to do everything they could to make the Germans happy, to help them in their war effort as they moved rapidly towards Leningrad in the hopes of capturing the Soviet second city. This all happened in the wave of a wartime advance, not as it happened later in other parts of Europe when the Germans were on the retreat. From the Lithuanian perspective, assisting Germany meant national liberation. So what about Lithuanian anti-Semitism? Well, this is where things get quite strange, because unlike other parts of Europe, including places like France and even the United Kingdom, there wasn't whole-scale anti-Semitism in the lead up to the Second World War. Certainly it existed in Lithuania, but it was mostly tied up with communism. That is, that many Lithuanians perceived the Soviet Union as having been led by Jews. If you think of the Jewish intelligentsia, such as Trotsky and those that helped in the October Bolshevik Revolution, it was perceived, albeit wrongly, that Jews were the leaders of the communist movements, and that to the extent that Jews within Lithuania were collaborating with the communists, they were then seen as agents of foreign oppression. Now, in truth, only a tiny minority of Jews were involved in Bolshevism. Indeed, within Lithuania, many Jews were deported to Siberia after the Soviet occupation because many of them occupied high professions with their property confiscated as members of the bourgeoisie class and class traitors to the proletariat. So why was it that in Lithuania the Holocaust was so total, with 95% of the Jews being wiped out? Well, there are multiple reasons for this. The first is that the Jews in Lithuania had no previous comparable experience. Remember, this was something that happened early on relative to the rest of the Holocaust. Lithuania had been previously occupied by Germany in the First World War, and many Jews remembered that time without any sense of undue persecution, i.e. they didn't necessarily personally fear the Germans in the way they desperately needed to fear the Nazis. That made them easy to identify and easy to be placed, rounded up and taken away, either in ghettos or to killing fields. The next reason is that the German army were advancing into the Soviet Union. This was part of the initial wave in Operation Barbarossa, with the idea of dismantling communism in the East. As Jews were perceived by the German army and the Gestapo as being communist sympathizers, it was considered a military necessity early on to execute all the Jewish men they could find who might put up resistance. This would tragically also assist in the destruction of the rest of the Jews later on, because with the Jewish men taken out of the picture, the women and children were, of course, easy targets. The next reason is that tragically, non-Jewish Lithuanians benefited materially from this destruction. As the German army marched through Lithuania towards the Soviet Union, they found value in taking all of the property in very wealthy areas of the major cities that belonged to the Jews, selling off all of the furniture in various auctions, and rewarding Lithuanians who would collaborate with the German army. So then, to what extent were the Lithuanians directly involved in the Holocaust? Well, for any first-year undergraduate historian, the works of Raoul Hilberg is required reading, who wrote the seminal Destruction of European Jews. And he kind of divides people up between perpetrators, collaborators, and heroes. Well, it's more nuanced than that. There are people who collaborated because they shared the German ideology. They were fascists. They believed in the social Darwinism and the racial superiority and the need to purge their societies of non-ethnic elements. But they were a small minority, placed in positions of power by the Germans who were occupying Lithuania, issuing the orders, and were the ones leading the destruction of Lithuanian Jews. The second group are much more numerous, and I would call those, as Deichmann does, cooperators. These are people that don't share the Nazi ideology, but wanted to impress the Germans so that they could be rewarded with their national identity. And they were cogs in the wheel, if you like, of a machinery that resulted in the destruction of the European Jews. Not people that personally killed any Jews or even necessarily were aware of what was happening to them. And remember, this was early on in the piece, before, Auschwitz and those major industrial killing centers were commonplace. It is highly improbable that the vast majority of Lithuanians truly understood what was happening to the Jews, even though they must have known that the removal of Lithuanian Jews, placing them into ghettos, exporting them overseas, was obviously a massive human rights abuse. But the important thing to remember about those who were cooperating with the Germans is that they weren't necessarily anti-Semitic themselves, but were instead looking for national liberation and the destruction of communism, and were willing to put aside their own moral compass in order to support the Germans in their quest for destroying the Soviet Union. And yet, if you read the diaries of the German officers, of the Gestapo, of the police, the various memos, it is clear that the vast majority of Lithuanians were not keen on any of these pogroms against the Jewish people. They had enemies that they thought were far more important, but were willing to put those aside in order to keep the Germans happy. The important thing to remember with this is that this was a German-led enterprise. It was German ideology that resulted in the destruction of the European Jews, including in Lithuania. It is unfortunately the case that many Lithuanians, in the earnest desire to be liberated from Soviet occupation and to have a nation state, were willing to do things that were totally unacceptable. But not all, of course. In fact, there is an award handed out by the Israelis called the Righteous Among Nations. It means those non-Jews who at great personal risk and sacrifice helped and assisted to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. There are 916 recipients in Lithuania of this award, and I will just talk about two. One by the name of Ona Samaite. She was a librarian in Vilnius who would go into the Vilnius ghetto under the pretext of taking and burning Jewish literature where in actual fact she was taking that to save the literature while smuggling in food and supplies to help alleviate the Jewish suffering. She did her best to help Jews escape from the ghettos rather than be taken away and executed. She was instrumental in preserving key works of Jewish literature, of which over 100,000 pages of that work survives, in large part due to her personal efforts. The other was one of history's unique figures, Chiune Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat in Kaunas who disobeyed a direct order explicitly given by the Japanese High Command that no Jews were allowed into Japan. He issued thousands of visas en masse, writing them 24 hours a day as long as he could stay awake, to give Jews the opportunity to escape across the Soviet Union onto a boat to Tokyo and then traveling around the world, where their descendants live to this day in places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and elsewhere. Thousands of Jewish lives saved. And he was so desperate to help these people that he even, in a final act, wrote blank sheets of paper with only a consulate seal thrown out of the carriage as he was being taken away, begging for forgiveness of the Jewish people that he wasn't able to save more. It's estimated that between 2,000 and 6,500 Jews were saved, with 40,000 descendants by his personal efforts. So what about how Lithuania remembers the Holocaust? And this is where it gets murky and complicated. On the one hand, one of the allegations is fair, and that is there were individuals that we know about who did participate in atrocities against the Jewish people in Lithuania, and none have been prosecuted for their crimes. They've all passed away now. There is no opportunity to get justice for those victims. It is understandable that given the massive amounts of contrition that we see in Germany, the hunting of Nazis all across the world, the fact that zero of the Lithuanian collaborators, those that had embraced the Nazi ideology and carried out crimes on behalf of their German masters, the fact that they have not been brought to justice is understandably a painful piece of knowledge we must deal with. That said, some allegations are untrue. Like I said, Lithuania was not especially anti-Semitic even at the time. They had lived side by side among many hundreds of thousands of Jews for hundreds of years. Secondly, the allegation that they are somehow shirking responsibility for the Holocaust is overblown. The fact is that unlike other countries in which the Holocaust took place, Lithuania did not have autonomy over its own political decisions. It was occupied by the Soviet Union, then by the German Nazis. They simply were not in control of those decisions, and a lot of power was being placed in the hands of pro-German fascists within Lithuania. Finally, and related to this, is the fear among some Lithuanians that focusing on the Holocaust will undermine their national narrative of liberation. That is, that Lithuanians who had been occupied by great powers, who struggled against oppression, who suffered greatly over decades, that whole origin will be undermined by the tragedy of the Holocaust. And to that I would say that things can be good and things can be bad. That is history. The truth is that Lithuanians are the most pro-democracy, liberty-loving, freedom, rule of law, sovereignty of the individual, protecting of human rights people that I've ever met. The fact that they are feeling pain from this Holocaust, wanting to forget, is understandable, although it is misguided. And it is pleasing to see how greatly the attitude has changed, both through the parliamentary resolution, the comments from the Lithuanian president, the new museums that are opening, the changes to education, the focusing of the righteous among nations. And I have every confidence that Lithuania, to the extent that it needs to, will address these issues in the coming years and decades. I have no concern that Lithuania is anti-Semitic. I have serious concerns about the revival of anti-Semitism elsewhere in Europe. I don't really understand it in France and other places, but Lithuania I don't have that clear, and I commend the Lithuanian government and the Lithuanian people of the great steps forward that they're taking on this subject. Thank you so much. Goodbye.